Our speaker today is Greg Borzo. He is the author of The Chicago L, a book published in 2007. He has a master's degree from Northwestern University and is an award-winning journalist. He was editor of Modern Railroads magazine and has been a health and science writer for the American Medical Association, the Field Museum, and currently the University of Chicago. He conducts public tours about the L, local history, and The Devil in the White City, which was a book published a few years ago. And he conducts these tours for the Chicago History Museum, the Chicago Cycling Club, Forgotten Chicago, and other organizations. Besides the Chicago L, his books include Chicago Cable Cars and Where to Bike Chicago. You may have seen him discuss biking on NBC Channel 5 here in Chicago. Copies of Greg's books are for sale today out in the lobby, and there's also a free copy of a Tribune article on his work available on the table outside this room. So please feel free to pick that up as you leave. So again, I think this is going to be a great program, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Greg Borzo.
Thank you very much. What a nice welcome. Especially the railroad song. That was a nice touch since we're going to be talking about railroads today. So it's great to be here. Does that light limit the quality of the slides? I like the images to really pop because we got some really good images. Is that better? All right. So we're going to talk about the L. And it's how it's such a great and unique institution and structure for the city. But before we get started, I just thought I would maybe tell a story about being a writer, because I'm still excited about that. It's still a pretty new experience for me to be writing books, because I've been a journalist writing articles most of my career. But books are different, and I'm sure there's some authors here in the audience, or if there's anybody who's like tempted to put pen to paper and write a book, I would say go for it, because a lot of fun things happen, including my being here speaking to you today. But a little story about something that happened to me once because I was an author. I was going to an event, and I usually take the L everywhere I go, as you might guess, the L or my bike. But sometimes when you give an event, you have to carry a bunch of books and signs and materials. So this one time I borrowed my daughter's car to go to this distant event, loaded it up, and came to a red light and got rear-ended. So I was really upset, especially because I'm very strict with my daughter, and I knew she would use that as a way to get back at me, all right, you messed up my car. And so I left the sunglasses on, and I took the camera out of the glove compartment. This is back before I had a cell phone with a camera in it. The camera to take a picture of the crime scene, and I was really loaded for bear. I went back there. The young lady who bumped into me, though, was just the opposite, very apologetic, and, oh, it's my fault. And so then I looked at the bumper. There was really just a little scratch. So I decided to let it go, but I didn't want to let her off scot-free. I wanted to teach her a lesson, right? So I said, okay, we won't call the police. There'll be no insurance report. You can just go on your merry way. But you have to buy 2 copies of my book. That's pretty bad, isn't it? Shows you the depths that an author will go to sometimes. She wasn't too happy about that. It was kind of extortion in a way. And she was like a little put off, and but she knew I had her. So she said, what's your book about? I said, it's about the L. Oh, that was okay. That was cool. I'm happy to buy a couple books. She pulls her checkbook out, and my husband, he loves the L, and his birthday's coming up. So could you inscribe a copy to him? We were getting to be good friends here. This is working out. So I said, sure, I'll assign a copy to him. What's his name? Jeffrey Bear. And so she starts to spell his name for me, and I said, well, Jeffrey's a friend of mine. I'd never met his wife. And I said, here's the book, open it to page 6, and you'll see I know how to spell his name because he's thanked in the acknowledgments, So after that, we parted best of friends. There was a message on my machine, though, by the time I got to work later in the day from Jeffrey saying, what was this all about, extorting money from my wife? But since I'm an historian and a journalist, I like to back up my stories with evidence. So here's a copy of that check that she wrote to me for not one but 2 copies of the book. So honestly, stuff like that happens all the time, and go for it. I hope one day I'll be reading some of your books. So looking at the L, it's really a special, really an institution. It's a cultural space that we share in Chicago. So I want to give you kind of the quick top 10. 10 things I'd like you to go home with that you're really going to remember about the L. And we're going to run through them pretty quickly. But first, just a few quick facts, just to kind of clear up a few misconceptions. The L is actually a very, very important people mover. 500,000 people ride every day. It's not always this crowded, but you get the point. I mean, if all those people were in cars, there would be a lot more traffic and pollution and other issues to deal with. Also, the L is safe. And the purpose of this picture is to say that, yes, there are accidents on the L on occasion. And when it happens, the accidents are often very picturesque and memorable. They make the front page of the newspaper. But often, few, if any, people get hurt. And over the course of the L's 121-year history, over 10 billion people have ridden the L with only a handful of accidents and fatalities, as regrettable, of course, as those are. But really, the L is a very safe way to travel. And the L is fun. People don't think of it usually in those terms. But one day I was trying to get on the Brown line, and this is what greeted me as I was trying to enter the car. They wouldn't let me in because it was a private fashion show with models running up and down the aisles and photographers clicking pictures. But you can charter the L. You can have a birthday party on there. There are regular trains that circle the L system, and they have concerts on those trains. So we need to remember that the L is, again, a shared public space where people get together who might not normally get together. You rub shoulders with some of your neighbors that you'd never met before, that you wouldn't see otherwise, and sometimes you chat with people and make friends or whatever. I'm in a book club, and one time I was sitting there reading my book, and someone came and sat right next to me, pulled out the very same book. So of course that led to a little conversation. That kind of stuff happens on the L all the time. It's really a precious, valuable tradition, organization, cultural space that we should value and help preserve. All right, let's get to the top 10. Starting here, counting down. Many people are surprised to learn that the L was built by private enterprise. Individuals like Charles Tyson Yerkes raised money and paid for the building of the L. Now, as the title of the book about Yerkes indicates, these were often, shady characters, you might say, or ruthless businessmen or robber barons, but they got the job done. And to this day, we benefit from what they did. Yerkes was the main builder. Now, we could spend a whole weekend just on him, but I have one slide, one image here that maybe sums it up a little bit for you. He was very good at taking other people's money and getting his way in every possible situation, even bested J.P. Morgan and others. The public didn't like him. They blamed every crowded train and every delay of service on him. And the press didn't like him. And he was corrupt. He bribed aldermen and the mayor and the governor, et cetera, as did the other builders of the L. But he became the archetypical robber baron of Chicago. And this image sums up how he was viewed by the press and the public. This, of course, is that famous image of Jesus driving the moneylenders out of the temple. But in this case, the figures, the faces, are Chicago politicians and businessmen. And our friend Yerkes, right here, clutching a transit car with one hand and scooping up nickels with that little tray with the other hand. And so that's what it was about. It was about making money. And so Yerkes and others like King Mike McDonald, he built the Lake Street line. He got his wealth initially through vice and alcohol and went on to build an L line. So that's how it happened. So the very first L in the United States of America opened in New York City, 1867. And here's an image of one of those builders, probably just as corrupt and ruthless as our Chicago builders. He's up on his elevated train trying to convince the investors on the sidewalk to give him some of their money. Now, this L didn't work very well, but as soon as New York got one, Chicago wanted one. A little bit of a second city complex even back then. But it was the Windy City, and they did mostly talking. That's the origin of the term Windy City, a bunch of talkers, and nothing happened for decades in Chicago, even though they kept saying, oh, we got to have an L. That's the way to go. It's a good transit concept. Nothing happened until the 1890s when a catalyst got Chicago to move off the dime. And anybody want to guess what that was? Exactly, the World's Fair. And so that's why the very first line in Chicago went from downtown to the far south side to help transport people to the World's Fair. So starting in 1892, we had one line going from the Loop south. The second line up was King Mike McDonald's line on Lake Street going west. And then we had another line going west and branching out, basically today's Blue Line. That went up in 1895. And then 1900, it went north up to Wilson and ultimately up to Evanston and Wilmette. Then, in the same decade, Yerkes built the downtown loop connecting these four lines. So in just a decade, the whole skeleton of our current L system was constructed. Now, that's pretty amazing. Today, it'd take a decade just to reopen an existing station that had been closed. I mean, with all the paperwork and all the hurdles. But in just that short decade, we have basically the skeleton of our current L system upon which additional lines and services have been added. So we really have to tip our hat to those entrepreneurs. So again, no CTA until 45, when the CTA was created to actually rescue a bankrupt and decrepit L system. All right, number 9. The L is a very unlikely survivor. I'm surprised. The more I study the L and Chicago transit history, the more I'm surprised that the L still exists. And to explain why, we're going to take a 30-second run through the history of mass transit in Chicago. Starts, I forgot to put that up there. Unlikely survivor. Okay. It starts with the omnibuses. These were stagecoaches that are basically converted to routes within the city. Anybody could get on, pay your nickel, and off you go. Public transit. Next up were horse-drawn rail cars. Faster and smoother, a big improvement over the omnibuses. But still, you got these fellas up front who are expensive, and you need a lot of them. You only work them about 4 hours a day, so you had to have a lot of these horses to run a rail transit system. And, of course, they leave stuff behind in the streets. So it's not a good solution to an urban transit system. So everybody in Chicago, and actually around the world, was looking for a better technology. How do we improve on this horse model? And they looked at everything. Compressed air cars. They looked at steam locomotives to pull transit. They even had battery-powered cars, like our hybrid cars of today. Talk about ahead of your time. with this solution, these cars ran for 5 years on the south side of Chicago, down in Englewood. We had everything you could imagine. We had transit that worked with wind-up springs. You'd wind the spring up and release it, and the car would shoot across the rails. You had transit cars powered by internal combustion gasoline motors, engines. So they just kept looking everywhere and experimenting. Almost all of this at the same time, all this experimentation was going on, especially in Chicago, which was the center of transit innovation. So they came up with a pretty good solution. And you think I'm going to say the L, but no, that's still a ways down. The good solution they came up with in Chicago, cable cars, just like in San Francisco. Imagine that. Again, we could spend all weekend just talking about our forgotten and really derided, ignored cable car story. But by cable car, I mean the cars like you might have ridden out in San Francisco. They have a grip in the middle and then this cable under the street. And the operator would grab that cable to move forward and drop it in order to stop. 25 years we had cable cars and ultimately built up the largest cable car system the world has ever seen. Something to think about. And so there's a photo of cable cars operating on LaSalle and Randolph. I've had historians tell me I'm wrong. I got the wrong city. It's San Francisco. But no, I got pictures to prove it. And I even, after the L book, I wrote a book about the cable car story because it is so forgotten. Proof that we had a cable car story is this building. Recognize it? Michael Jordan's former restaurant. It was built as a cable car powerhouse, Illinois and LaSalle. More proof is underneath the streets of Chicago. Every time they do some major street project, they dig up old pulleys and shivs and bars and different kind of yokes, and there's a structure that was built under the street to keep that cable moving. So finally, we come up with another more lasting solution. And again, it's still not the L. Next up in this parade of technologies are electric trolley cars, starting in 1890. So unlike the cable car, which is completely mechanical, these were electric. They ran from overhead electrical wires. And they really took off. Then finally, into this whole mix of overlapping technologies, you finally get the L. 1892, as you saw. That was our first L line in Chicago. And here we have the L, finally on the scene, right? Wait, that doesn't look like the L. Well, this is the technology that the Lake Street line purchased. And this is what the L was going to look like on Lake Street and possibly throughout the city if it had worked out. Now, you're saying, oh, that's just a drawing, right? That's like somebody's idea. Well, here is that very train on a test track in operation at the manufacturers, and it was very efficient and it was a very good technology. It had one fault. It was very expensive. So the first L lines went with traditional railroad technology of the day. And what was that? Steam locomotives. The first L's were pulled by steam locomotives. Chug, chug, little engines they could. Now, they were smaller than the big steam locomotives that you'd see on the main freight line railroads. But this is how things started. So, getting back to the point of how is it that the L still exists today? It was competing against all these other technologies, and all these other technologies are gone. Trolleys, rail cars, omnibuses, cable cars. They're all gone from Chicago except the L. That's because, I believe, because the L did not get in the way of automobile traffic. And that's a dangerous thing to do in this society. In our culture, the automobile is king. And so here you see a trolley causing a traffic jam. There's no cars ahead, and there's a bunch of cars behind this trolley car. And here's another shot showing you how the trolleys competed directly with automobiles. And so that meant they were doomed. But the L is circulating fast above the freight. Of course, the pillars on Wabash, get in the way of cars, but not as much as if the train had been running on the street. So we're very, very fortunate, and it's a bit of an oddity that the L still exists, that it still operates. All right. Next up. The L saved our oldest buildings in Chicago. It's directly responsible for the continued existence of our oldest, most historically precious buildings. How can I say that? Well, that's because the fire of 1871 burns the city down. And then people start, of course, building new buildings. And here is one of the few post-fire buildings, 1874. Very shortly after the fire, this Washington Block building went up. And lots of buildings, of course, went up all over the city as the city rebuilt from the fire. Then, starting in the 1890s, the L went up, and it went down certain streets and not other streets. So it went by the Washington Block building, it went by the Old Colony building, Van Buren and Federal, Van Buren and Dearborn. And this is an important building because once the tallest building in the city. And all around the downtown loop, you can just examine old building one after another. One of my tours for the History Museum, we circled the loop. I hope all of you will join me on that tour someday. We circled the loop and we just look at all the incredible old buildings like the Old Colony, like the Monadnock buildings. All these buildings, cheek to jowl with the L. Here we're looking north from the L platform on Dearborn, and on the left you see the Monadnock buildings, very important in the history of architecture around the world, because the first Monadnock on the far end, all brick, 16 stories, thought to be the tallest load-bearing commercial building ever built in the world. People come from all over the world to see that. Right next to that, the second half of the Monadnock has a steel frame. So right here you've got the transition from brick to steel. Two types of skyscrapers side by side. Well, they're still standing today because they're right next to the L. Again, we're on the L platform looking north, and these are right there. Now, look a little farther north, and you'll see a lower building. That is the old Federal. Here. The old Federal building, and that's what it looked like. Glorious, attractive, important building. One of the most attractive buildings ever constructed in the United States of America. Encyclopedia of Chicago says about this building, no building more perfectly expressed Chicago's ambition in the 19th century to be the country's preeminent municipality than this, the Henry Ives Cobb Federal Building. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever visited it. They used to have an observatory up on the top of this glorious dome. They spent $2 million just on interior decorations in this building. But, again, going back to that photo, it was a block away from the L. Therefore, it was torn down because the thing that happened is that corporate America, insurance companies, condominiums, they just didn't want to have their building next to the noisy, dirty L that poor people take, that casts a shadow on the sidewalk, and so they left the buildings along the L alone. But going in a block or two in all other directions, they tore buildings down wantonly. And so we lost the Federal Building and many, many other gems. Now, we still have a lot of building going on in Chicago and tearing down of old buildings, but today we have a little bit more protection for historical buildings. Here on Wabash, you see what's happening. there's a scaffolding holding up the facades of some old, lovely, architecturally important buildings. The building was torn down, but the facade was protected. And the result is a facadectomy like this, where you have these Italianate kind of beautiful fronts, but right behind it you have a big, in this case, condominium. Now, why is it that today condominiums are going up along Wabash right next to that dirty, noisy L? Why is that all of a sudden? All of a sudden they don't mind putting a building here. Well, that's because of Millennium Park. Look at the views that that condominium we just looked at enjoy. And so all along that whole corridor you have new condos going up and old buildings being torn down. But other than that, all around the Loop L, preservation of old buildings. All right, so another point, it's really old. Some people don't really give it credit or understand how very, very old and how unique the L is. So with that, to make that point, I have a slide, and maybe somebody could recognize where it's from. Any guesses?
The Eiffel Tower.
That's amazing. How'd you get that?
Oh, I don't know, Greg. Maybe because I've known you for 10 years.
All right, so the reason I throw the Eiffel Tower up here, two reasons. 1889 is when it was built, and it perfected a construction methodology called riveted plate steel. So it's about the same age as the L, but also the L was built with a very, very similar construction methodology. And so there's, a pretty good strong link there. So maybe it's a little over the top, but I think of the L as kind of like an Eiffel Tower laying sideways. But the two are very, very strongly linked. So again, back to the age of the L, here is the oldest transit station still standing. And you think I'm going to say in Chicago, but in the United States of America. This goes back to 1892. This is one of the original stations on that first line that went south to get to the fair. Today it's in terrible shape, boarded up. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but maybe I think they should turn it into a museum. We'll see. Very first L car has been preserved. Here it is, car number 1. Beautiful wooden car, kinds of gold trim and etched glass, and it's we're very fortunate that someone had the foresight to save this car. And it is now at the Chicago History Museum on display. So you can go in there and actually sit in it and get a feel for what it might have been like to take that very car down to the World's Fair when the fair was only a nickel. And so here is that car being installed at the History Museum. I'm going to make you go there yourself to see it in better detail. But you can see here they shrink wrapped it and cut a special hole in the second floor of the museum to roll this car in there. That's how valuable it is. I said earlier on this point that the L is also unique. Well, again, Paris and lots of other cities have L's. But no other city in the world has an elevated train system that crisscrosses the downtown and actually defines the city center. In every other city, New York, Paris, you name it, if an L exists, it's usually on the outskirts of the downtown area. So our Loop L is unique and gives Chicago really a big part of its definition and character. All right, let's keep moving here. The L helped the city and suburbs to develop. And to make that point, here's a slide of the L being built at a point in Chicago. Anyone want to guess, other than you, where this was shot? Well, believe it or not, 1906, this is Lincoln and Lawrence, right down Lincoln Avenue here. And here they're building the L, which you may know goes down to ground level at that point. That's why they're working on the ground, preparing the way to lay tracks. But it shows you that much of Chicago was farms and fields and prairies and marshland when the L went in and pushed the way out for the city, much as highways do today. Here's the L going up north, what's now the Red Line at about Sheridan. Not much out there, just one little cluster of houses there in the distance. And so onward. There are lots of examples of that. This is Isabella Station. There isn't an Isabella Station anymore, I don't think. But this is what it looked like in 1928. Nothing out there except an L station. And so the L was used actually to promote sales and the development of subdivisions. Here you see an excursion train going out to Villa Park, 1910, running along L tracks, taking people out to an area where they could pick out their house or their lot. And this is a photo of the farthest reach of the L, all the way out to Mannheim Road and 22nd Street. And this was actually kind of maybe a bridge too far because they had to pull this line back and discontinue service. It reached farther than the city was growing at the time, so that didn't work out. But otherwise, it often really accounted for the development of the city and suburbs. All right, so the L has carried some very surprising cargo. Newspapers, back before there were automobiles and trucks, before there were televisions, radios, and newspapers, televisions, radios, and the internet, there were newspapers. And there were dozens of papers, some of them with several editions every day. And L cars and L tracks were used to whisk those newspapers out to the city and suburbs on a regular, devoted kind of newspaper train service. There were also funeral trains. Again, 1906, really only a handful of automobiles in the whole city. There were no hearses and trucks and roads, paved smooth roads out to the distant cemeteries. So the L realized that there was an opportunity to make some money, and they set up a funeral service with these cars devoted to that purpose, with a beautifully adorned car for the caskets and the mourners. And then you'd just add more cars to the train as needed. During the peak of the service, 200-300 funerals a year. So it really was a very, very vital and important service. It'd get people out to a funeral more comfortably than if they had to ride in a wagon over dusty or muddy roads. The L also carried freight. I mean, serious heavy-duty freight. And here you see a coal train at about Bryn Mawr or Berwyn, about Berwyn and Clark, Broadway. That's where it is, over by where the Leal Coal Company used to be. I believe there's a Dominic's or Jewel right in that big mall parking area. And so this train is delivering coal to the gasification plant there. And during the peak of the service, there were over 300 tons of coal carried around on the L every day. Much of it to service the needs of the L itself, but in many cases to service the needs of customers along the L lines. The L also carried the interurban trains. Right on the L tracks, you had the interurbans running. And here's a picture of the fabulous Electroliner of the North Shore line. And wonderful service. You could get from the Roosevelt L station to Milwaukee in 88 or so minutes on one of these wonderful trains. And that's probably quicker than you can get up there today. But the service was wonderfully integrated. Here's a shot of the Wilson station where you have the North Shore line and the L trains working together, coordinating schedules, and that also happened out west, the Chicago Aurora and Elgin. Here you see an interurban pulling in, and you could either stay on the interurban, go all the way, kind of like express service to the loop, or you would transfer to an L car for all stops. So a wonderful integration of the two, and in fact the best days of the L ever were in the late 1920s, just prior to the Depression, and so part of it was because of the integration of the interurbans and the L. All right, so moving right along. These get a little faster as we go. The subway, surprisingly, is really an afterthought in Chicago. We have 105 route miles in the rail system of the L, and only 11 of those are subway miles. Well, how did we end up with a subway? Again, the system started as an elevated system. Well, a history of subways starts in London, first ever, 1863, and then Boston got one, 1897, and again Chicago says, oh yeah, let's build a subway. You know, that's the way to go. Boston has one, other cities have one, we need one too. Nothing happened in Chicago on this front for a long time until another catalyst came along that kick-started the idea, that made it economically possible to build an L. And you're all going to guess what that is. No. Century Progress is a very good guess, but that wouldn't explain why we needed a subway all of a sudden, or how we could afford to build a subway all of a sudden. WPA, the Depression came along, and there's a clue to that point in this slide. You see the sign on the fence. This is a construction site for the subway. The acronym, there were many, many acronyms, and so there was PWA and WPA. They were both existed. Over the years, the programs were invented and changed and recreated, and so you'll see on the sign at this construction site, this is North and Clybourne, where they're putting in the L in I don't know if this is 39. The L construction started in 38. Oh, this is 31. I can see on the 39. There we go, 39. And so there's a clue in this photo. So let's zoom in on that sign, PWA, Public Works Administration. There's also Works Progress Administration, et cetera, many different agencies of this time. And so what happened is the Depression hit, and a lot of people needed work, were looking for jobs and would do anything. So the government looked around for, shovel-ready projects like we did just 4 years ago, and a real shovel-ready project was the subway. So here you see workers underground in this big tunnel structure that dug through the mud underneath the streets to build a subway. And so it was miserable work, but these men were happy to have jobs. The work was so bad, so unpleasant. One job was mud cutter, so he had a big curved knife, and he'd slice slabs of mud off of the edges of this ever-growing tunnel. And then there was the mud mucker, who would pick up these slabs of mud and throw them in a little wagon, some kind of car, and take it out and use it as landfill. So very, very tough work. But no sooner did this work start in 38, a 3 years after, the war came along. And so all of a sudden, the boys were sent overseas, and there was no longer a surplus of labor, a terrible shortage of labor. So the subway building projects were shut down in Chicago. There were 2 projects going on at the time, and they actually shut one down, and the other was allowed to continue because of a link that Chicago had to the president. They had Roosevelt's ear, and Roosevelt allowed one of the 2 projects to continue because the justification was that it was essential for the war effort. Whether or not it really was is another issue. But so we had the subway continue to be built, the one under State Street, and when it opened in 1943, here's a nice publicity shot showing a soldier coming out of the subway, kind of trying to indicate, yeah, see, we told you it was essential for the war effort. But basically, it was we're lucky that it continued. The second line was continued after the war and after some of the shortages of steel, aluminum, rubber, etc., copper, were resolved. And it didn't open until mid-late 50s, the other subway line. So, here and there are pieces of subway around our system. But that's how and why we even have any subway trackage in the city. Remember, it's quite a bit more expensive to build a subway than it is to build a surface line or an elevated line, especially in Chicago with the muddy soil conditions. So it's incredible we have any subway in our system. All right, so coming down the home stretch, just for fun, some great and odd, funny sights and scenes all along the L line. A beautiful architecture, of course. It can be appreciated differently and sometimes better from 20, 30 feet above the ground. World-class architecture we have in Chicago. Here's a nice shot showing the Trump Tower going up, reflecting the steel siding of the L cars in the foreground. So just tremendous opportunities for photo ops all around the L system for tourists and locals as well. Here's a great shot by my friend Bruce Moffett showing our pink line, our newest line in the system, passing under that beautiful green kind of awning shed at the Harold Washington Library. Very pretty colors mixed together. And by the way, that's the Fisher Building on your left, another very, very important old building that still stands thanks to its proximity to the L. Besides beautiful images, there's some horrific images that you could have seen from the L, including the line out in the stockyards. Imagine rumbling over the pens at this time with the smells and the dust that would have been present. So here see the L line chugging around the stockyards. It was a serious line carrying people to work. It also carried a lot of tourists out to the yards for a tour of the slaughterhouses. A very, very popular thing to do, and they'd take a little tour and then go have dinner at the Stockyards Inn, right? Make it a day, right? But it was so popular that it's kind of illustrated in this postcard showing tourist attractions of Chicago. Here we have the Art Institute right there with the Stockyards. I mean, what could be more opposite in some ways than those two institutions? One of my favorite stories about sights and scenes along the L is the Clark House, the white house up on the stilts there in the background. This is Chicago's oldest building, 1836 it went up, on the outskirts of Chicago, all the way down at 14th Street and Michigan Avenue, okay? And when the city grew and engulfed the house, the owners wanted to get away from the city, and they moved their house out farther south. Well, the city quickly caught up with it again, and so the Clark House was eventually abandoned and got run down, was used for all kinds of different things, community center and this and that, had a couple fires. Well, in the 70s, the city started to value its history a little more, so they decided, well, let's rescue this house, and let's actually bring it back to its original location. So that's what's going on here. They're moving the Clark House back up to 14th and Michigan, near there. And so the problem with that was that an L line had been built in the way over the years. So either you had to go all the way south and take it all the way around all of the different L lines that were in the way, or you'd simply hoist it up roll it across the L tracks, drop it down, and truck it over to 14th and Michigan. Great idea. Great idea. You'll see in this slide that it's December of 77 when this project was underway. And so they actually lifted it from this side, turned the electricity off, rolled it across the tracks, and it was December, a very cold day, and the hydraulic equipment froze, so the house actually sat up there for 3 days on those stilts. And it looked ugly, burnt out, decrepit, and a house sitting on stilts. Imagine going to work and seeing that for the first time and wondering if you'd missed it the last 500 times you'd gone by, and like, what's going on here? Well, this eventually found its way to the Prairie Avenue Historic District, and I'll encourage all of you to go visit this house. It's a gorgeous museum today. You won't recognize it from this picture. They've done so much to restore it. So do visit that. But every time I ride the L, even though I've ridden it, I was born near the Brown Line and I've been riding it most of my life, I'm always glued to the window, and there's always so much to see. It's so fascinating. You'll just be surprised by silly little funny things like these mannequins on the side of a building to advertise the services of a management company. Another favorite sight and scene of mine is this bicycle on the roof of a bike shop in Uptown. And what's fun about it is that it has a motion detector, so when a train comes by at night, the wheels light up. So you have people in the train that are kind of looking for this. It's kind of fun. So I got up on the roof of this building to shoot a picture because I really wanted to include it in my book. And hey, it was fun to shoot it, and the trains would come by. I'd listen for a train, get ready to snap the photo. And I was all done and finally kind of closing up my camera and everything. But I heard another train coming. I thought, okay, quick, one more shot, and then I'm out of here. And look what came by. The famous Santa train, which only passes each point in the whole L system a couple times during the month of November when the train circulates around the system. So I was happy to get my bike, because I'm a bit of a bike nut, and Santa and the train and the L and everything, all in that one picture. All right, so here we go. Number 2, we mentioned this before, the World's Columbian Exposition has a very important influence on the L. We already said that it was the catalyst that led to the first line. All right, people wanted to get down to the fair. A tremendous number of people went down there, and so there just wasn't enough carrying capacity, so the L really contributed to getting people down there. But on the grounds itself was an elevated train. It's called the intramural, and you can see it in this photo. Everything is backwards. Why is that? This is the train running around the fairgrounds. And it was a ride, kind of like a monorail, but it was also a way to get from exhibit to exhibit and building to building. And here you see that elevated train going past a village of teepees, and basically the system worked like this. At each of those 2 red dots was an end of the line, and the train just turned around and went back around, back and forth, I'm sorry about that, all day long. And so here's one of those turning loops. You see how the train turned around. Well, why I'm making a big deal out of this train is because it pioneered, for the first time anywhere in the country, a new idea in transit. Let's use electricity to run an elevated train, and let's use an uncovered third rail trackside source of that electricity. Well, that's exactly what we use to this day on the L system. So that idea was pioneered at the fair. Of course, it's been improved and updated over the years. But that uncovered third rail trackside electric power came right out of the World's Fair. And I told you before, the first L's were pulled by steam locomotives. Well, that little train at the fare worked so well that they converted all existing lines to electricity. And here you see that conversion going on one of the lines. And then, of course, all the new L lines were built to that specification. So I think it's a travesty that so many things attributed to the World's Fair doesn't include the L. I mean, we know Aunt Jemima, juicy fruit, the pressed penny, Cracker Jacks. There's a famous beer that won a blue ribbon. There's, of course, the Ferris wheel. Everybody knows about those elements of the fair that were significant and still exist, but they don't realize that the very L system comes right out of the World's Fair. So I think we should add that to the mix. Okay, our last point. Despite all the interesting, hopefully, things we've been saying about the L, it's endangered. I'm not, I honestly don't know what the future holds for the L. We've lost over 8 miles of this traditional steel-structured L system around the city, and many, many more miles have been lost of other types of service, like at ground level, and embankment service has been torn down, discontinued. And so there's a map we created for the book, and we're going to zoom in on that map, and this shows you portions of the system that have been lost. Everywhere you see the little X means that that line has been torn down. The Humboldt Park branch at the very top is the one that we just looked at with that slide of things being torn down. The Stockyards branch, torn down, et cetera, et cetera. So we've lost a lot of the system. Downtown, this is the loop looking west over Van Buren, and that portion of the tracks from the loop going west was torn down. There used to be a station at, let's see, it was on Wells between Jackson and Quincy, the Wells terminal, and into that terminal came L trains and interurbans. And here you see that beautiful station and a tremendous volume of traffic through that station. Here you see it being torn down. So every time there's a budget shortfall or a crisis of one kind or another with government, they look to the L as a way to save money, cut corners. And so, you open the newspaper and it's always some dire crisis. So I really believe the L is endangered, and I'm not certain about its future. This slide shows you how the L has been valued over the years. It's a pot-belly stove burning coal to heat this station on the Ravenswood line, the Brown line, up until the 1970s. Okay, that shows you where the L stood and still stands in the eyes of politicians and a lot of business interests. So, how long is it going to last? And I believe it'll always be there, but will it just turn into a little tourist attraction, or will it grow and serve transit needs as well over time? We'll see, but it'll take a lot of support to make sure that happens. So, we have a bonus. One more quick little point, just for fun. I believe the L is Chicago's greatest movie star. All right, so there's just a whole host of movies that feature the L in fun, exciting ways. Spider-Man 2, one of the best. So many scenes depicting the L, and they tried to make it look like Gotham City, but no, you could tell that it was Chicago from the equipment, the buildings, the stations, everything. So that's one of my favorite L movies. There's just so many. This one, Running Scared, with Gregory Hines and Billy Crystal. Great chase scene where the cab is chasing a limousine along on the L tracks, the great crashes and everything. Sandra Bullock stars in While You Were Waiting. She played While You Were Sleeping. Thank you. CTA agent who falls in love with one of her passengers. And Chuck Norris, Code of Silence, plays an honest cop, chasing bad guys all over on and in the L. There's so many that I started keeping lists, and I have over 100 movies that feature the L in some very significant or fun or interesting way. And I've actually made a list of my top 10 L movies. And I brought some copies of these flyers along for anybody who would be interested. We'll set them out back or in the other room where the reception is. We'll set them out there, I guess, so you all can take one of those home and maybe rent some of these movies on Netflix. Watch for them. Very, very fun stuff. All right, so the list, is very, very numerous. Cooley High, Blues Brothers, of course, Risky Business. There's just so many movies that have fun L scenes. I want to end with a 10-second clip from one of my favorites. This movie's called Just Visiting. And it's the story of a French knight who gets transported from medieval France into modern-day Chicago. And he's transported with his horse, his suit of armor, and even his serf. Okay, so I don't know if you all saw this movie. It came and went pretty quickly, but it is hilarious. It's a great movie, not just for the L scenes, but it's really funny. And Christina Applegate plays his girlfriend back in France and also in Chicago. So there's all kinds of shenanigans going on. The knight, Jean Renault, basically spends the whole movie trying to get back to France. So he's running around Chicago on his horse and doing all kinds of inappropriate things. And so let's see him on the L. He's being chased by the cops. He rides his horse right up the stairs to the L platform at the Harold Washington Library. And let's pick up the action right there.
I've never ridden the L quite like this before.
Isn't that something? And the kicker is that the CTA doesn't really want me to play this clip for you. They've asked me not to. And first I thought, well, what are they worried about? Why? What are they worried about? Are they going to think that you'll get the wrong impression and you're going to start taking your horse on the L? No, that's not their concern. Their concern is that you're not supposed to eat on the L. And that portrays kids eating. So with that, I thank you so much for your time and attention.